about exactly what to do about it. And many of the details in the schools white paper, which came out recently, which sets out the sort of direction for reform, but the details are still to be worked through. And I think, we probably all know some of the problems. Demand has risen massively in recent years. So the number of education and healthcare plans, the so-called EHCPs, have about doubled in the last decade, I think. And that, of course, means that the current system is completely overloaded. The system is also complicated and difficult to navigate. And of course, what you then see in an overloaded and complicated system is that too many kids are missing out on the support they need. And, why does the Sutton Trust involved in this? Because that matters hugely for social mobility. And that's because we've seen in previous research that kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are both more likely to have SEND needs in the first place, but less likely to get the support they need, partly because their families have less resources to be able to fight through the system. And consequently, those kids suffer what we call a double disadvantage, which needs to change. And this research that we launched this morning, it really shines a spotlight on one of the elements of that double disadvantage. And so the research finds at the headline level that the top state schools in the country, the stats here, take in about half as many disadvantaged pupils with SEND as the average comprehensive, and crucially, a third fewer than live in their local campus area. So that, when you look at that, that raises some really big questions about fairness, about inclusion, and about access. And so with the schools white paper, as I say, setting out some of the broad direction of travel for reform, including better provision in mainstream, this feels like a good moment to sort of take stock of where we are. So what should reform look like? How do we build a system that is inclusive? And how do we make sure that young people with SEND, particularly those from low-income backgrounds, really do get a fair shot in life? So that's what we're here to discuss this morning. We've got a brilliant panel with us to explore these questions. Panel, you're going to have an hour to solve the SEND conundrum.
Easy.
Yes, exactly. I know Georgia Gould and the DFE team are waiting with bated breath for some answers. So let me introduce the panel quickly. So we have first Charlie O'Regan. So Charlie is Schools Engagement Manager here at the Sutton Trust, where she's developed our Fair Schools Admissions Pledge, I always find that hard to say, and supported over 100 schools to review their approach to admissions and implement changes to make the schools more accessible. And prior to joining us, Charlie was a teacher, secondary school leader, specialising in behaviour and outcomes. Then we have Alistair Strathern MP. So Alistair is the MP for Hitchin and a parliamentary private secretary to the Chancellor. And in Parliament, Alistair has focused on the environment, SEND and online safety. And he is also a former maths teacher and, interesting, climate insurance lead at the Bank of England, I believe. So welcome, Alistair. Then we have Lisa. So Lisa Lloyd is a best-selling author of Raising the SEND Between Us, in which she recounts her journey raising 2 neurodivergent children. I've got 3 neurodivergent children at home. We were just swapping war stories before we came on here. And Lisa is also a SEND campaigner with over 145,000 followers on her ASD with a G&T Instagram platform. Do take a look. And she ultimately campaigns to ensure all children with SEND have access to education in a way which caters to their needs. And last but not least, we have Chrissy Yates. So Chrissy is a former exec principal, director of inclusion and founding principal of a free school. And with her deep expertise in SEND and inclusion, Chrissy has supported schools, trusts and local authorities to develop inclusive practice at the classroom and strategic level. So that's the panel, a brilliant group to discuss this, as I say. We're going to start with Charlie, who will take slightly longer and share some key findings from the report. And then we'll go to the other panellists who will each give their perspectives for 5 minutes or so, then we'll go to the questions. So Charlie, over to you first.
Thank you for the introduction, Nick, and good morning, everyone. And I just really want to start by agreeing and sort of reinforcing what Nick said, in that we really see SEND as an issue that is relating to social mobility, and that's why that we've started doing research in them. It's something we really care about. As Nick said, children that have SEND and are disadvantaged have the lowest educational outcomes of any group of children. And if we think about some of the key things that have come out of the white paper in terms of having more children educated within a mainstream setting, that admissions element starts to become really important. So that's why we've done the work we've done. I'm going to start by just doing a quick recap of some of the double disadvantage headlines, just to contextualise the work we're doing. And I'll spend some time talking about selective inclusion, which is what we released today, and then end with a little bit on ways forward and what we think should happen. So double disadvantage, as Nick said, we found that children from low-income backgrounds are more likely to have SEND, but less likely to access the support they need to thrive in their education. We were really interested in why this was happening, and particularly why they were less likely to access the support. So we polled over 4,000 parents to try and understand the patterns. What we found is that families from middle-class backgrounds are more likely to apply for an EHCP, and they are more likely to get an EHCP, in part because they are significantly more likely to use the tribunal system, which is wild because we all know the tribunal system usually falls in favour with the parents. So some of the reasons and things behind this: working class families are more likely to pay for private assessments. Where I live in Kent, when I was told my son needed an assessment, the wait time was 6 years. So if you can avoid that, you will avoid that, is where we're at. That means because they're paying for private assessments, they're twice as likely to wait less than 6 months. And meanwhile, working class families, 33% of them are waiting more than 2 years for their assessment. And as many of us will know in this room, you need the assessment to unlock the specific support that you need. They were also just more likely in general to spend money on their EHCP applications. So 68% of middle class families spent money on their EHCP compared to only 28% of working class parents. This is a system that is designed to be free. It is not designed to be spent money on it. And yet 11% of middle class families spent more than £5,000 on their EHCP. And all of this means they're more likely to get an EHCP. And who gets an EHCP really matters for two key reasons. First of all, that's your ticket to a special school, and special schools are often what it is that we're all fighting to get our children into. Special schools, and the parents that we polled were thought of incredibly favourably with high levels of satisfaction. So that's one element of it. The other element of why EHCPs matter is because they do act as a protective factor in children's education. So we asked the parents about their satisfaction with their school, a range of different support measures within their school, how happy is their child at school, and does their child feel like they belong? Universally, children without SEND ranked higher than the children with SEND, but in the children with SEND bracket, children with an EHCP ranked higher than children that were on SEND support but didn't have an EHCP. Actually, they were closer to children without SEND than they were to children on SEND support. So what that shows us is that having an EHCP really makes a difference to these families and these children. We also looked at the impact of having a child with SEND on the parents and family life, and we found some really, really shocking statistics. So a third of parents have changed their working arrangements in order to have the time to get the support for their child. 16% left the workplace altogether. At the same time, 14% of families were going into debt to get the support their child needed, so they're working less and having to go into debt. We also found people borrowing money from family to get the support they needed. We found, unsurprisingly, high levels of stress in families of children with SEND and social isolation and isolation from their families as well. And then just finally on double disadvantage, we asked parents what they thought should be done to support children with SEND, and pretty much across the different groups of parents we asked, middle class, working class, have a child with SEND, don't have a child with SEND, universally parents felt that wherever possible, children should be educated in a more inclusive mainstream setting. And obviously there are some tensions there because we know that parents are trying to get their children into special schools, so we're not there yet. But the ideal was that they would be in a mainstream setting. And the bit of the report that surprised me in the nicest way possible was that, again, universally across parents, they felt that an inclusive mainstream benefited not only the children with SEND, but also the children that didn't have SEND, that socially diverse settings were open for everyone. So that kind of set the scene for our understanding of SEND and social mobility. We know there's a double disadvantage there. So that then led us to selective inclusion. So some of you may have seen that we've done decades of research now into the issue of admissions and high-performing schools. And what we've seen kind of over and over again is that high-performing schools, secondary comprehensive schools, have fewer children eligible for free school meals. They're not taking their fair share, fewer than the national average and fewer than the local average. What our new research shows today is that same pattern is found for children that are receiving SEND support as well. So if you are eligible for free school meals, or if you have receiving SEND support, you are less likely to access a top performing school, even if there is one, near where you live. So there is national segregation and localised segregation going on. So we wanted to understand again why this was happening. So when we talk about high performing schools, we're talking about top 500 state comprehensives, and we had 3 groups. We judged them by attainment 8, progress 8, and 4+ English and maths crossover. Nick spoke about some of the statistics around when we looked at attainment 8. I'm going to go with the kindest measure possible, which is the progress measure.
Very good of you.
Just for context, yeah, as a former school leader, we'll go progress. What I would say, regardless of the accountability measure that we looked at, the patterns were the same. By every progress measure, high-performing schools are not recruiting children with SEND or children that are disadvantaged or children that are disadvantaged and have SEND at the rate that they should be. So if we look at progress 8, for example, the top 500 schools...
So there's nowhere to hide in the
nowhere
stats.
to hide in the stats, exactly.
Yeah.
Top 500 schools by progress 8 took 20% fewer children eligible for free school meals than lived in their catchment area and 9% fewer children with SEND. If you then look specifically at the children that are disadvantaged and have SEND, that statistic jumps to 26%. So they're taking a quarter too few children that live in their catchment area. When you contrast that with children that have SEND and are not eligible for free school meals, so they're more affluent counterparts, there are no gaps in access. And what this tells us is the SEND access gap is driven almost entirely by their socio-economic status. If you are disadvantaged and have SEND, you are going to struggle to access a top school. If you are not disadvantaged, you'll probably be all right. So this is clearly another example of the double disadvantage that we found in our first report. So we polled 2,000 senior leaders to try and get an understanding of why this happened. Most concerningly, we found that 41% of senior leaders in schools think that other schools, or report that other schools, proactively discourage children with SEND from applying to their school. If you are a parent of a child with SEND or you've worked in schools, you may well have heard of this or experienced this yourself. Obviously, that is completely unacceptable, it's illegal, and it's not in any way okay. I do think we need to think about why they might be doing that. We don't have the specifics in our research to understand why that's happening. It is very likely, in our opinion, that underfunding of schools, poor staffing in schools, and accountability measures that do not reflect the challenging context that you have, in fact, they disincentivise you from having a challenging context, are all part of the issue here. Other issues that came into play were school reputation. So 63% of school leaders said that reputation for SEND provision and 55% said that reputation for inclusion were the 2 biggest reasons why some schools had differing SEND cohorts. And differing approaches to behaviour was another popular answer. So 1/3 of schools said that, many of you will be familiar with the zero tolerance versus nurturing approach to school behaviour. That comes into play as well. Finally, in that report, we asked schools what they would need to educate more children with SEND. The most popular responses were more staff. So more teachers and more TAs, please, would be really helpful. And then it was more access or better access to specialist support, such as speech and language therapists or ed psychs. Schools with the highest proportion of children with SEND and the highest proportion of disadvantage were more likely to say that changes to accountability were needed to educate more children with SEND, so there were some differences there. I'm just going to end by adding on to what Nick's already said about our stance on the white paper and SEND reform and where we think things are going well. More than anything else, this second report really highlights that the double disadvantage exists and is a massive contributing factor to the disadvantage gap and the SEND attainment gap. Anything we do from now on regarding SEND reform must bear the double disadvantage in mind. We welcome the overall push to more inclusive schools. Our parents want that. And it shows that there isn't that cliff edge in support anymore. So the wider tiered support system with ISPs as well as EHCPs is a welcomed introduction because it means that we're not having this cliff edge of support where we're having to fight for an EHCP to access support. We do think that more needs to be done to address the backlog in assessment and diagnosis, and you shouldn't have to wait years or pay thousands of pounds to get that. And this report really highlights the need for the workforce to be a crucial element of SEND reform. And finally, we were absolutely delighted to see fairer admissions referenced in the white paper. And I think what this report shows more than anything else is if mainstream is the aim for children with SEND, we need to get admissions right for the full socio-economic range of children and not just for those who can buy a house close enough to a high-performing school.
Thank you, Charlie. So nowhere to hide in the data. Definitely an inclusion problem going on there. Alistair, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie. Not just for, I think, a really interesting report, but also a report that validates all of my priors, which is always really useful. Look, I think one of the really striking things about the report is not just how powerful some of the data points are, but how aligned they'll be to the anecdotes of pretty much every school leader, every parent that's had to battle with the SEND system in their local area over the last 5 years to a decade now. You can point your fingers at a whole host of reasons for why we're here. Under-resourcing of schools, narrowing your curriculums, hollowing out of early intervention support, a system that's encouraged need to be identified and more advocacy-led rather than need-led approach. But fundamentally, we have inherited a system where far too many young people, particularly young people with very acute needs, are being let down and failed. And it's imperative of us and imperative as a government to put that right. I think there are a few points I want to really lean in behind from kind of Charlie's analysis. I think the difference in parents' ability to advocate for their child, whether that's financial or just kind of wider social resource, is so telling in my area in terms of the outcomes that young people are able to kind of secure. There's not a school I've been to where the head teacher has not been able to talk me through some quite heartbreaking cases of young people who desperately do need extra support, but for a multitude of reasons, their parents haven't always been best placed to help advocate to ensure they can get it. And equally, you know, there have been lots of parents who maybe have had more financial resource, who've been able to go out, get that private diagnosis, get that support with their tribunal case, and be able to secure support for their child, which is fantastic and important, and their young person's better off for it. But shouldn't rely on all of those extra resources to be able to get them to that point. Not only is that bad for the system, it doubles down on a whole host of educational inequities that anyone who cares about tackling socio-economic disadvantage has got to be really, really focused on. Alongside that, I think the kind of challenge we've got as kind of leaders in our local area is that wider accountability point too. You know, the issue is not evenly felt across the school system. There are schools in my local area that all the parents will know. You know, you don't need to go far to speak to parents in this space to know, who are very welcoming for young people with additional needs. And there are schools that, for whatever reason, often, to be honest, culture and leadership from the top are less so. Now, that's not just a real issue for people who'd like to go to some of those schools who are less welcoming. Over time, it becomes an issue for schools that are trying to do the right thing too, because as everyone in the room will no doubt be aware, that kind of lifeboat effect makes it even more challenging over time for schools that are trying to be inclusive, because quite rightly and quite understandably, they then become the school of choice for more and more parents in that local area, because why on earth would you want to send your kid to anyone other than the school who's really interested in supporting their needs? And as they then become the school of choice for more young people with additional needs, they face even more of the same system pressures that we've been talking about now. And I think that system pressure point is really important, because I think sometimes we look at the SEND crisis as a failure for the young person and the family involved, and it absolutely is. Young people with additional needs, and particularly young people with additional needs from disadvantaged backgrounds, are being deeply failed often by the system. But when that young person's failed, and when some of their peers with similar needs are being failed, it's not just them, it is the whole classroom. And that whole classroom, whole school system challenge means that over time the SEND crisis has not just become an issue for young people with additional needs, it's become a whole school performance and whole school attainment issue. And where that issue is concentrated on young people with disadvantage, that means it's become an increasing problem for schools who are in disadvantaged areas, who are likely, as a result, to particularly sharp edge all of these challenges with the fewest resources to help manage them. So, as the government, it is imperative that we do something about it, and I'm very glad that we have not shied away from some really big and bold reforms to try and put that right. Now, I think it's probably no secret that we haven't always done a great job over the last few years at putting in the hard yards when it comes to designing and winning over stakeholder and system support for big and important reform agendas. But I'm so glad that so far it looks like SEND reform is proving a big and important exception to that rule. I think the way that Georgia, Bridget and the whole DFE team have kind of led on stakeholder engagement over many months now on this is really paying dividends, both in terms of the way it's landed, which I think has been surprisingly positive compared to what the media narrative might have led you to believe it was going to be going into the white paper announcements, but also the richness of the programme that's been developed. And three, I think, really important principles behind it that won't be silver bullets, but will start to address some of the challenges that Charlie's laid out there. Firstly, making sure that we are enabling the system to provide support without the need for such advocacy far earlier, putting real money behind that too, not just in creating additional statutory layers of support and need that schools will be responsible for providing, but also putting real money behind trying to get more speech and language provision out of the bureaucracy of those EHCP assessments into frontline education, where it used to be, and where actually all of the evidence suggests it can have the biggest possible impact in supporting positive educational outcomes for young people, and particularly for those young people whose parents might not have been able to help them access those higher tiers of support under the current system. Alongside that, making sure that we're putting in place real systems of accountability, to make sure that we're doing far more to challenge school leaders to live up to the very best that's currently being provided. I think it's absolutely right to say that more resource, more specialist resource is always important, but fundamentally if some of the best school leaders can already provide inclusive settings, that shows that actually really fundamentally at the end of the day it is about culture and leadership at the top, and making sure that we've got system-wide approaches to holding every school accountable for putting in place that ethos, those processes and practices, and that leadership accountability around the values of inclusion that we all aspire to and we know parents want to desperately see too. And finally, alongside that, join that up with the workforce strategy too. But we could throw billions more pounds into the system tomorrow, but without a proper workforce strategy to bring back educational psychologists, speech and language therapists into the profession, where so many are being driven out by the pressures over the last few years, we're still going to be having more money chasing after scant resource. So I think the workforce strategy element, which is starting to come through now, but I think will be the really important part of it for us to continue to develop, is going to be so important underpinning the success of that wider strategy. Now, alongside that, I think some of the grandfathering elements have been pretty well designed to maintain stakeholder support. There are lots of bits of individual changes that I'm very welcome to see based on feedback from my local area and local authorities. I think those key themes, making sure that we're shifting support earlier to make it more needs and less advocacy-led, ensuring that we've got strong accountability and a good workforce strategy to underpin all of that, hopefully can finally start to put right some of the failings we've seen, not just for disadvantaged people who've got additional needs, but every pupil in those schools who's currently being felt that isn't working.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those elements of reform as we get into the discussion. So, Lisa, over to you in terms of your experience.
So I'm not an expert like everybody here. I'm just a knobby influencer, to be honest.
Frontline experience, as we know, matters.
That's the thing.
So,
I am an expert with my kids. Well, actually, I'm still not that either.
I don't think one ever is an expert with one's kids, right? So,
so basically, I've got two autistic children. I'm autistic myself, which is why I'm going to try and stick to these, because otherwise I'll ramble on for an hour about this. But so I've got two children, very, very different. One is a rule follower, very good, masks at school. We often call him the fun police. He will tell off teenagers for dropping litter and tell me off for my parenting, my poor parenting quite often. And then I've got my daughter who's got PDA. Don't know if people know about that. It's pathological demand avoidance. So she basically feels like the rules are there to be broken. So complete opposite children. Now, we've sort of lived through the different schooling settings. So especially with my son Finley, he started off in mainstream. Mainstream at the time had no SEND provision. Then when he got to around year 2, year 3, they then opened up the SRP there, which was specialist resource provision. And then he attended that, and now he's in a SEND school. So we've sort of seen all the different sides of it. Now, he ended up in the SRP there because he was failing so badly at mainstream and couldn't cope there. He started off school advanced. He was ahead with everything. He was talking by the age of 1, knew his whole alphabet, everything. We were actually the horrible, smug, gloating parents that were like, oh, our child is just so clever. We didn't realise it was his special interest at the time was phonics, and it was the autism coming through. So he then became a shadow of himself at mainstream. He started really struggling. He started getting more and more behind, and he was having meltdowns every morning. We were having to force him to go in. I was spending the day crying. The teachers were sort of dragging him in, and thank God they opened up the SRP there, which changed everything for us. We had the battle of the EHCP, which, you know, his assessment for a diagnosis took 4 years, and then we had a battle of an EHCP, which took a couple of years. When he got that, he attended the SRP, and then he could cope more, and he started progressing again. So, you know, that's sort of proof in itself of what is needed in mainstream, so that these provisions do make a difference. However, and I don't want to be all doom and gloom about the white paper, but myself and lots of other families, obviously I speak to them online a lot about this and hear from them, we do have a lot of reservations. We do have a lot of concerns, and I think one of them being that we still don't really know everything about it at the moment. We still, you know, even just from hearing what are complex needs, what is that classed as? That is a huge worry for us parents, especially of the ones that I class as the send-betweeners. Like my son, he's academic, verbal. On paper, he looks like he would be fine in mainstream. However, the reality is he can't cope in large classes. Yeah. He can't cope with the noise, especially at secondary, going to different classes, different teachers, and he can't deal with the social aspect of that, and he needs a SEND school. And my concern is he would be one that would be classed as he would need mainstream and be fine in mainstream when he actually wouldn't cope at all. And I think we really do need some confirmation on what they are classing as complex needs. There's lots of other reservations from families that I've spoken to as well, is, you know, the ISPs not being able to be appealed at tribunals. You know, there's a lot of issues with that. We know that the parents win most of the time with tribunals, and it seems like the ISPs replacing the EHCPs would be taking a lot of rights away, which is a huge concern, as well as being able to name the schools. So we do welcome, obviously, mainstreams being more inclusive and more teacher training, more teachers, speech and language in mainstreams. This is incredible. But we cannot forget that a lot of children still need SEND schools as well. A lot of autistic children, neurodivergent children, children with disabilities still will not cope in a mainstream environment, and that can't be forgotten. And one of the big concerns that I've heard about is the government looking at removing the debts from the local authorities if they push for mainstreams, not SEND schools. And that is a concern, that children, because the local authorities obviously do not want their debts, are they going to push some children into mainstreams that shouldn't be? So those are the thoughts on it anyway. And it sounds very doom and gloom, but it's very, very difficult, because you're not ever going to get it right for everybody, unfortunately. But there's just a lot of questions that need answering still, I feel.
No, thank you, Lisa, and I can absolutely empathise. And it's a scary prospect as a parent, thinking your kid might be pushed into a thing which you know is not going to work for them, and therefore it's going to blow up. So I can completely empathise with that. So no, absolutely understood. So Chrissy, last but not least, let's go to your thoughts. Solve it all for us.
Absolutely, that's what I'm here for. Right, no, I wish it was. I wish it was that easy. I think, as Nick said at the beginning, I've worked in schools as a school leader for 20 years. In the last couple of years, I've also had the privilege of seeing that from an LA point of view as well, and working closely with Kent County Council to support how they've implemented some of these structural reforms early as well, and now working for Step Lab, so an international organisation deliberately working with teachers and leaders to develop classroom practice, because I think reform is great and much needed. Implementation is going to be the key here, and I think the biggest difference and the biggest impact that we're going to have on children is through our teachers. So in terms of kind of what the white paper brings, I'm cautiously optimistic. In terms of, I think the principles are sound. I think it is about how the implementation and clarity will come through that system. So it's no surprise to any school leader or any teacher that the expectation mainstream has increased, absolutely. And teachers and leaders want to meet that challenge. They really do. And you're absolutely right, there will always be children for whom specialist schools are going to be the most appropriate place, but inclusion should be the core business of every school. That is the side of us as a society, I think. But to develop that, and workforce development is key, absolutely. I welcome any more educational psychologists, language therapists, anyone that's going to be those experts at hand as they're being referenced to kind of really support what teachers and leaders are doing. But we cannot negate the need for really effective teacher development, and we can't leave that to chance. It can't be the details I'm sure will come. One and done sessions on how you support children with a particular barrier aren't going to have the impact that we want them to have. This is about meaningful engagement with the sector and really high quality opportunities for teachers, teacher assistants and leaders. That's who's going to really drive those changes forward. And they're the people who are on the front lines every day. I think consistency is absolutely welcomed within the sector. So having some more consistency and details around ISPs, EHCPs, all of the expectations there, because that's going to give a better deal to everybody and allow schools to be more inclusive. Because if your provision isn't wildly different in terms of inclusion from the school down the road, those equality gaps will probably reduce significantly. The bringing back Best Start family hubs, whatever we're right phrase, Best Start. There we go. I've got the thing going there. Brilliant, because the earlier that professionals can see and intervene with children, the easier that's going to be for everybody involved, and the more supported their parents in particular will feel. With the ISPs, I share some of the reservations around kind of detail and how that's going to work. I think good schools already have similar things in place, either that for pupil passports or similar variations. But we've got to be careful with those, that they don't deviate too far from what's happening in the classroom, because we know the research shows us that interventions outside of the classroom, taking children out from their learning time, does not have the positive impact on them that you might want. So it's got to be kind of tailored with that what's the best classroom practice in mind. I could talk about accountability for a long time. I will mention it briefly, I promise. I really welcome the concept of an adapted progress 8 measure for children with low prior attainment and high levels of needs. I think that is, as a school leader myself, I have made very difficult decisions previously around making choices that are in the best interest of the children I serve and not in the best interest of my accountability for Progress 8. You have to be brave to do that, and you have to be someone who's not afraid to make that call, knowing that essentially you are going to be accountable for that to Ofsted, to your governors, to everyone else that's involved in that process. So I really welcome any reforms around that, because what we need to do is inclusion needs to be seen by schools as a real benefit and a strength and not a risk. And that will impact hugely. We've seen the Ofsted data over the weekend. We know that disadvantaged schools are scoring lower at the moment in terms of their attainment scores, for example, achievement scores. There's some really easy ways to fix that. We'll have a longer conversation about that later. That would be fun. But there are lots of positives. So absolutely investing in the workforce. PD is absolutely, professional development is the key mechanism for supporting inclusion and meaningful change in practice. Collaboration is incredibly powerful. And again, I briefly referenced, but where I've been working with Kent, this is a model they've got from other local authorities as well, we've implemented communities of schools. So we already have 53 communities, groups of schools across the county who are working in these collaborative groups to really kind of drive progress and work together effectively. And it's much easier to hold each other to account if you've got schools who are saying, actually, we don't really do great things to children with sent here. It's very hard to say that when you're in a room full of people who are going to have those professional conversations with you. There is careful implementation needed, absolutely. I've talked about the ISPs in terms of clarity. There's a huge workload risk there. Our SENCOs are incredible. They work so hard. They are absolutely an engine room and a powerhouse of great practice, but that needs to be shared across everyone in a school. So those close collaborations across leadership teams, if we put more bureaucratic pressure on SENCOs, they can't have the impact where they're needed most. They can't be in those classrooms and working with our children and families because they're busy doing paperwork. So we need to be aware of that. I second what Lisa said about SRPs and the really positive and powerful impact that SRPs can have. But we need to be very careful about inclusion rooms. And we need some real clarity around that, because I think in principle, having a space where children feel safe and secure and they can get additional support could be really beneficial. But we need to be careful about lethal mutations, because inclusion rooms are used in different contexts, in different schools across the country, and I think some real guidance and expertise around that would benefit everyone. Coming back to that kind of core element of admissions, I've sort of alluded to some of this already, but absolutely your reputation as a school can sometimes make you a magnet school. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you've got great provision, why wouldn't you shout about it, and why wouldn't parents want to come to you? Absolutely. But it's also about that equalising of good practice across all schools. And when you are in a situation where you have a high number of disadvantaged children and a high number of children with SEND, and interconnecting, intertextual, issues, without the funding, that's the real situation, because those children do need additional support, and whatever that looks like, it's going to be very different, but those pressures can't be ignored. Schools, in order to be more kind of positive in terms of admissions, absolutely need to know they've got security in terms of accountability measures. They're not going to be punished further down the line for being really inclusive of their intakes, and I think having that consistent access to timely support is going to make a real difference there, because that will improve schools' confidence to meet those needs. For parents, I think there's a lot schools can do in terms of when they are having conversations with prospective parents, or actually parents they've got currently within their schools, making sure the SEND information report is really clear, accessible and transparent. Because again, another barrier to people understanding what access they have to provision in schools is that. I think Charlie mentioned about behaviour policies earlier. There's a lot set up kind of zero tolerance behaviour policies. Now, schools obviously use those in different ways, and it can mean different things, different places. But as a parent, you'd want to know that actually, okay, there might be a really strict behaviour policy. Great, I want my child to learn in a safe and secure environment. But I also want to know that school's going to make reasonable adjustments for my child's need. And actually, that might be all it needs for a parent to realise that that school is accessible to them as well. So I think inclusion is how great schools operate. I really, really welcome that, and think, as I said, PD is the absolute key mechanism for making this work in practice. But that element of we need a bit more clarity and detail. These are proposals and consultations at the moment that will really help shape that, but we must make sure we consider teachers, teaching assistants, school leaders, SENCOs, everyone that sits within those areas, because they are the people that are going to support children and support parents. And we need to really, really care about the quality that we give to them in terms of professional development. So we really need to care about them as people. I've yet to meet a teacher or school leader that doesn't care about children. So if we have school leaders, and was it 41% of the survey saying that they think some school leaders discourage children from going to their schools, we really have to ask ourselves why that is. Because I guarantee it won't be because they don't care. I guarantee it won't be because they don't want to be inclusive. What are the pressures that are impacting on those?
Brilliant, thank you, Chrissy. Can I just ask, would you see, you talked about the accountability measures as an important part of this. Would you put something in admission codes to mandate that schools take their fair share?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I
don't
want to swerve that question. No, I think in terms of would I mandate it, I think it's really hard when you start applying quotas in individual circumstances. I think it's more about if we make the conditions right for school leaders to do that in terms of they're not going to be penalised 5 years down the line if they're.
Set up the conditions and the incentives rather than,
I think so too. I think that kind of, you're going to get more with carrot than stick in that sense, I feel. Otherwise it's just, I fear with some things it becomes another box to tick. I do think there's scope for school leaders feeling more confident in doing so.
Anybody disagree with that?
I disagree.
Aha.
I don't entirely disagree. I completely agree that there is a two-pronged approach to ensuring that more schools take their fair share of children with disadvantage, and absolutely we 100% need to make the conditions right for schools. In the meantime, I think we could benefit from some legislation that requires schools to consider how they are inclusive. But no one knows better than me how complex that legislation would actually be and how you would put that into practice, and that is really complicated, and I agree that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to how you ensure that schools take disadvantaged children.
Those systems and processes are in place around it. I think we could do that at the moment. It's too soon at the moment, but
And I share your concerns around getting children into high-performing schools is good, and then what? Because if those schools are not used to having lots of children with SEND and lots of children with disadvantage, and they're not set up to support them in the way that they need, then we are letting those children down, we're failing them. And part of the work that we do at the Sutton Trust is we do onward support with the schools that follow our fair admissions approach, so that they are supported to do that with students. Because what they need is largely the same. They need high quality teaching from the best teachers possible, but they also need a little bit extra as well. So we need to make sure that schools are upskilled to support them.
I think, let's just look at the time. I think I'm going to go to audience questions now. So please just maybe, Rosie, the front, just state. Go on, you can go first. State who you are and just short questions if we can, please.
Tom Simons from the Fair Education Alliance. Thank you for this really amazing research. I'm just interested in this question of accountability and whether you feel changes made so far this Parliament to how Ofsted will work with schools go far enough to encourage these kind of more inclusive cultures that we've been talking about as being so fundamental.
Maybe is that one for Alistair first? Is it maybe or
I think they're a strong start, right? I think you have to kind of simultaneously drive up the accountability for stepping up and matching the best levels of accountability, particularly when it comes to things like leadership and culture, where there are schools who could improve on that tomorrow if they wanted to, while also kind of systematically investing and ripping out all of the barriers to that being just easier for schools to do anyway. I think the approach the government is broadly taking in terms of driving up some of the top line accountability and using Ofsted as quite a powerful lever to do that, while also investing in removing some of those barriers before kind of the full bandwidth the new system comes into effect. Feels like the right balance to me. I'm absolutely sure, as with any reform agenda, there will need to be scope for fine-tuning and to be blunt. I think when it comes to things like admissions codes, to kind of force some of that behavioural change, I probably sit instinctively with the wait and see and introduce as you go along if needed, rather than look to force in now when you might end up actually forcing young people into some schools that culturally aren't looking to do right by them. Feels like the right approach to getting that balance right. But I'm absolutely sure that whatever we introduce now will definitely need some refinement going forward to ensure that we truly are bringing every school to the place we want them to be.
Anybody else want to just jump in on that one? Or should we...
Yeah, I think just very quickly, I think inclusion as an Ofsted focus is a welcome addition to most school leaders. As I said, I think the P8 adaptations in terms of having a different metric will have a really positive impact on that. And also I do think the removal of the kind of EVAC expectation is going to stop children being forced down a curriculum pathway that's not appropriate for them. There's a way to go. That's what I would say around that.
Next question.
I've got two questions. Sorry, I'm Claudia from Teach First. How does the panel think we rebuild trust then among parents that school actually is the best place for their children to be, especially if they have this kind of double disadvantage? We're seeing children missing education rising, we're seeing absence rising, we're seeing persistent absence remaining stubborn. My second question is, how do we kind of create this new measure for double disadvantage that both raises the floor without lowering the ceiling? I think we're seeing lots of leaders remain concerned that creating some kind of new measure will just mean that everyone performs worse as opposed to those suffering with double disadvantage perform better.
Two very good questions. I'm going to come to He's the first on how do we rebuild trust, which is a massive question.
It is, it's really tricky. I think a lot of trust has been lost, a hell of a lot, from everybody that I speak to. And I think this is where the white paper hopefully will help with it becoming more inclusive and everything. But I think there is very much a battle with teachers against parents at the moment, and it shouldn't be that way. And luckily I've been fortunate enough that the kids have gone to amazing schools with amazing teachers, but I think a lot of it comes from sometimes the teachers, there can be a lot of parent blame, and I think the other way around as well, the parents can blame the teachers. And I think things like the school fines and stuff do not help this at all, you know, especially coming from, you know, raising neurodivergent children who can't go on holiday during school term and things like that, and then they get fined for them being off during that time. And, you know, you've got emotional based school avoidance, and I think there's a real battle there where it seems like, and I understand it from the school's point of view as well, because they've got the pressure from above. This is the problem. We need the attendance up and everything like that. And that's coming across then to the parents. And I think